The wooden walls of the Memphis courtroom echoed faintly as Elvis Presley stood from his seat. Dressed in a charcoal gray suit, not a rhinestone in sight, he looked every bit the Southern gentleman his mama had raised. He cleared his throat and began to speak. Slowly, clearly, with the soft, unmistakable twang of Mississippi still wrapped around every word. The judge, a thin man with silver hair and a reputation for sharp remarks, leaned back in his chair, raised one eyebrow, and chuckled. "Well," he said loud enough for the courtroom to hear, "I didn't realize we were holding auditions for the Grand Ole Opry." The room erupted in soft laughter. Someone near the back stifled a snort. Elvis stood motionless, eyes steady, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. Then, as the last chuckle faded, he opened his mouth. And what he said next left the entire courtroom silent. It all started with a letter. Not one from a lawyer or a business partner, but from a woman named Martha Ray, handwritten on crumpled lined paper, folded twice, and delivered through one of Elvis's cousins who worked part-time at Graceland. She wasn't asking for money. She didn't want tickets or autographs. What she wanted was help. Martha had been living in a modest home just outside Memphis for nearly 40 years. It was the kind of place where the porch creaked when you stepped on it and wind chimes sang during every storm. But now, the county was trying to seize her land through a backdoor zoning maneuver to sell it to a luxury developer. The same developer who, ironically, had been using Elvis's name in promotional brochures without his permission. Elvis Country Charm, they called it. The irony wasn't lost on him. Martha was in her 70s, alone, widowed. Her late husband had once played rhythm guitar in a bar Elvis snuck into as a teenager. Elvis remembered him. And more than that, he remembered what it felt like to have everything taken from you just because you didn't have the right name, the right suit, or the right kind of voice. He read her letter twice. Then he picked up the phone, called his lawyer, and said, "We're going to court." His team tried to talk him out of attending in person. "It'll be a circus," one of them warned. "The press will twist it, Elvis. It's not your fight." But that's exactly why he showed up. He didn't come to make a statement to the media. He didn't bring cameras or stylists. He came because someone ordinary needed help, and he still remembered what it meant to be one of the ordinary folks. In the days that followed, people began whispering about the king's quiet appearances at county planning hearings. He sat on wooden benches with his arms folded, eyes focused, never once asking for special treatment. He'd shake a few hands, nod politely, and take notes. And now, weeks later, here he was, in a courtroom that smelled of varnish and sweat and old paper, standing in front of a judge who didn't recognize him as anything more than another man with a slow drawl and a cheap Southern suit. Elvis hadn't come to win fame. He'd come to defend something more valuable than land: dignity. When Elvis walked through the courthouse doors that morning, hardly anyone recognized him. There was no entourage, no glitter, no sunglasses, just a simple black suit, slightly wrinkled from wear, and a pair of scuffed leather shoes that had seen better days. He didn't even wear cologne, just the faint scent of soap and old wood from his study at Graceland. His hair, still jet black, was combed back plainly, and the only thing flashy about him was the quiet confidence in his eyes. The bailiff gave him a second glance, but said nothing. Reporters didn't swarm. The courtroom wasn't expecting a king. It was expecting a formality, just another case in the schedule. But Elvis didn't care. He walked in like a man with a job to do. As he sat down at the defendant's table beside Martha Ray and her pro bono attorney, a few heads turned. Some people whispered, "Was that?" No, it couldn't be. Why would Elvis Presley be in a zoning dispute? but Elvis kept his eyes forward. Across the room sat a line of corporate attorneys in tailored suits, tapping expensive pens and whispering into each other's ears. They didn't recognize him either. Not really. One of them made a joke about the Hillbilly Dream Team, loud enough to draw snickers from his colleagues. Elvis heard it, didn't flinch. He wasn't here to play the part they expected. He wasn't here to sing or smile or remind them of his records. He was here because someone's home was about to be bulldozed for profit, and she couldn't stop it alone. The judge entered moments later, adjusting his glasses, flipping through papers, and barely glancing up. Just another small-time case. Probably a quick ruling. He leaned back in his chair, expecting routine objections and legal jargon. Then Elvis stood to speak, and the moment he opened his mouth, everything changed. Elvis stood tall, hands resting on the edge of the polished wooden table. The courtroom was quiet now. The shuffle of papers and whispers had faded, the moment his voice began to echo through the chamber. "Your Honor," he began, "this case ain't about money, and it ain't about contracts. It's about right and wrong." That soft Mississippi drawl, warm, deliberate, with vowels that stretched like a Sunday hymn, filled the room like a slow song on vinyl. His voice didn't demand attention. It invited it. The judge blinked. Then he smiled. Not a warm smile, but the kind people give when they think they're better than you. "Well," the judge said, adjusting his robe, "I didn't realize we had a performance scheduled today. Tell me, Mr. Presley, is it? Are you planning to sing us through your testimony too?" A few muffled chuckles slipped out from the back of the room. Elvis didn't move. The judge leaned back, tapping his pen against the desk. "It's just, well, I wasn't expecting such a thick accent. Sounds more like you're fresh off the back porch than standing in a courtroom." The laugh this time was louder. One of the younger attorneys on the opposing side chuckled openly. Even the stenographer cracked a smile. But Elvis? He didn't smile. He didn't shrink. He didn't even blink. Instead, he looked the judge square in the eye, steady as a man who's been underestimated his entire life. Behind his calm expression, there was a glimmer, just a flicker, of the fire that made him Elvis Presley. With one slow breath, he said nothing. The silence began to stretch. The laughter died down, awkward now, uncertain. People shifted in their seats. The echo of the judge's joke hung in the air like smoke, sour and lingering. Elvis let it sit there. Let everyone feel it. Because sometimes the loudest thing you can say is nothing at all. Then, without raising his voice, he spoke again. "I reckon my voice may sound different to you, sir," he said gently. "But where I come from, how a man talks don't matter near as much as what he stands for." And with that one line, the mood shifted. Completely. The judge shifted in his seat, perhaps realizing, too late, that the room had turned. What had begun as a joke had now landed awkwardly in the silence. No one was laughing anymore. Elvis let the weight of his words settle like a stone in a still pond. Then he stepped forward. Just one small step. Not aggressive, not showy, just sure. "When I was a little boy," he said quietly, "my mama worked 2 jobs. She cleaned houses by day and folded clothes at the laundromat by night. And every night, no matter how tired she was, she'd come home, cook supper, and tell me the same thing before I went to sleep." He paused. "She'd say, 'Son, don't let the way you talk make you think you're less than anyone. And don't let the way others talk make you think they're more.'" A hush blanketed the room. Elvis wasn't just speaking to the judge anymore. He was speaking to everyone, to every person who had ever been laughed at for how they spoke, where they came from, or how they looked. "You see, Your Honor," he continued, "I've sung in front of presidents. I've shaken hands with kings. But I've never once judged a man by how he talks. Because where I come from, that accent, that's love. That's hard work. That's survival." He looked over at Martha, sitting quietly at the table, tears just beginning to rim her eyes. "And that woman right there," he said, pointing gently, "she don't speak like a Harvard professor either. But she's got more dignity in her silence than some folks do in a whole courtroom speech." No one dared move, not even the judge. Elvis finished with a voice as calm as a gospel hymn, but with steel beneath it. "So, if the sound of my voice ain't fit for this room, then maybe the room needs changing." That was it. The line. The one that sucked all the air out of the place. The one that stopped the pen tapping, the smirking, the sideways looks. Even the judge didn't respond, because he couldn't. For a moment, no one could. It was the kind of silence that didn't come from shock or shame, but from recognition. Elvis hadn't raised his voice, but he had spoken with something far louder. Truth. For several long seconds, the courtroom remained frozen. The judge stared at Elvis like he'd never seen him before. Not as a celebrity, not as a man in a suit with an accent, but as someone who had just held up a mirror to everyone in the room. Then, slowly, the judge cleared his throat. "Well, Mr. Presley," he said, his voice lower now, less certain, "you make a compelling point." But it wasn't really about what the judge said anymore. It was about what he didn't. Gone was the smirk. Gone was the performative authority. He didn't lean back with smugness anymore. He leaned forward with humility. Martha Ray reached over and gently took Elvis's hand under the table. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her grip said it all. "Thank you for standing up when I couldn't." Behind them, a man in a veteran's jacket nodded quietly. Across the aisle, a woman in a janitor's uniform wiped her eye with a napkin. These weren't fans. They were witnesses. Witnesses to a moment of quiet rebellion against judgment, against classism, against the tiny, easy ways people try to make others feel small. And then something unexpected happened. One of the attorneys from the opposing side stood up. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and addressed the court. "Your Honor," he said, "in light of today's testimony, the development group is prepared to withdraw its claim on Mrs. Ray's property and explore alternate sites for construction." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Even the judge looked surprised. "I'll, take that under consideration," he said, fumbling with his papers. "Court will reconvene tomorrow for final review." Gavel down. Case adjourned. As Elvis turned to leave, the courtroom didn't erupt with applause. That would have cheapened it. What filled the space was something better, respectful silence. The kind of silence given not to a star, but to a man who had just reminded everyone what real dignity looked like. No spotlight, no encore. Just nods, eye contact, quiet admiration. At the door, the bailiff who had barely noticed Elvis that morning leaned in and whispered, "That was the finest testimony I've ever heard, sir." Elvis nodded and walked out. Not as the king of rock and roll, but as the kind of man his mama had raised him to be. The story of that courtroom encounter spread quietly at first. It wasn't splashed across headlines or spun into tabloid gossip, but among locals, courthouse clerks, community organizers, and eventually fans across the country, it became something else entirely. A whispered legend. Not about Elvis the performer, but about Elvis the man. The clip never aired on national television. No one released a press statement. But people who were there that day, people who heard his words, who watched the shift in that judge's face, kept retelling the story. Not because of how famous he was, but because of how human he was. Because in a world that rewards volume, Elvis had chosen values. In a room that expected a show, he gave them a lesson. And that one line, "So, if the sound of my voice ain't fit for this room, then maybe the room needs changing," began showing up in places Elvis never imagined. Pinned to bulletin boards in schools, taped to mirrors in dressing rooms, shared at teacher conferences, town halls, and even courtrooms in towns he'd never set foot in. People began to hear their own stories in his. Anyone who'd been overlooked because of how they spoke, where they came from, or what they looked like. They saw themselves in that moment, and they carried it forward. Years later, when a young musician from Nashville was mocked online for her Southern drawl during an interview, she quoted Elvis. Word for word, she said, "If the room can't handle my voice, maybe it's the room that needs fixing." It was retweeted 1.2 million times. But beyond the quotes, the reposts, and the quiet reverence, there was something even more important. People started thinking differently, listening differently. Hospitality staff stopped judging guests by appearance. Judges remembered to pause before passing comment. Teachers re-examined the way they treated kids who spoke differently. Because of one courtroom moment. Because of one man who didn't fight humiliation with rage, but with a story, a voice, a truth. That's what made it legendary. Not the fame, not the power, but the choice to meet disrespect with wisdom. To answer mockery not with shame, but with a mirror. And to remind the world that the way someone sounds has nothing to do with the kind of person they are. It's not the accent that matters. It's the heart behind it. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of dignity, grace, and standing up for what's right, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We share stories like this to keep the spirit of compassion, humility, and quiet courage alive. Give this video a thumbs up if Elvis's words meant something to you, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that respect isn't earned through wealth or fame, but through how we treat each other, especially when no one's watching. What did you take away from this story? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss another true story that restores a little faith in the world. Because the voice may be soft, but sometimes it speaks louder than anything else.